Summer, 1944. The roads of Normandy. An American Jeep kicks up dust, racing along a narrow lane flanked by dense hedgerows. Inside, the driver and his passenger are dangerously exposed. Suddenly, a glint of steel, a thin wire stretched taut across the road at neck height, a decapitation trap. But a split second before impact, the wire strikes a crude metal pole welded to the Jeep's front bumper. With a sharp snap, the wire is severed, lashing harmlessly overhead. This simple, life-saving device wasn't standard issue, yet it was appearing on vehicles all across the front. What terrifying threat made it so necessary? This device, known as the wire cutter, would become a signature feature on Allied vehicles across the European theater. Its origin would become tied to a terrifying legend, a secret Nazi guerrilla force of saboteurs and assassins, the werewolves, ordered by Heinrich Himmler to wage a brutal shadow war behind the lines. But what was the real story behind the wire on the road? Was this simple steel bar a brilliant countermeasure to a fanatical insurgency? Or is the truth more complex and grounded in the anonymous ingenuity of the common soldier? To find out, we must return to the battlefields of Normandy. The answer begins in the last week of July, 1944. After 7 weeks of brutal, grinding warfare in the hedgerows of Normandy, the Allied front erupts. Operation Cobra, a massive aerial bombardment followed by an armored onslaught, shatters the German 7th Army. Suddenly, the war of inches becomes a war of miles. Allied divisions begin a breathtaking advance across France. Spearhead units, pushing through the crumbling German lines, sometimes cover 50, even 60 miles in a single day. This was the breakout everyone had prayed for. A blitzkrieg in reverse. But this incredible speed, the Allies' greatest weapon, was also their greatest liability. The vanguards of this race were the reconnaissance squadrons. Men in lightly armored M8 Greyhound cars, on motorcycles, and, most commonly, in the ubiquitous Willys Jeep. They were the eyes and ears of the advancing armies, scouting roads, probing enemy defenses, and locating bridges. But they were often hours, sometimes a full day, ahead of the main body of tanks and infantry. They were fast, but they were alone, operating on a razor's edge of calculated risk. And the terrain was a killer. The narrow, sunken lanes of the French countryside, lined with ancient trees and thick hedgerows, were perfect ambush alleys. For a retreating, desperate army, these roads offered a new kind of battlefield, a place where a handful of soldiers with simple tools could terrorize a column, if only for a few critical hours. The German strategy was brutally simple. Unable to stop the Allied tide, they could bleed it, not with tanks or artillery, but with fear. The primary targets were the commanders and scouts in those lead vehicles. The method was a low-technology trap of terrifying efficiency. A length of telephone wire, a steel cable, or even sharp piano wire stretched taut across a road, just high enough to be invisible to a driver at speed, and positioned at the perfect height to strike the neck of an unsuspecting passenger or driver. The threat was not hypothetical. Reports began to filter back to headquarters. Vehicles crashing, soldiers and officers gravely injured or worse. The psychological impact was immediate. Every wooded lane, every village street became a potential death trap. The Allied High Command was aware of the growing problem, but the war was moving too fast for a solution to come from a general's map room or an engineering depot hundreds of miles away. The solution would not come from a general's headquarters or an engineering depot. It would be forged in the field by the men who faced the threat directly. In one of the most well-documented cases, the answer came from a technical sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, William L. Warner. After witnessing the horrific results of a wire trap on a fellow soldier, Warner was driven by a single purpose. It could not happen again. His eyes fell on the perfect raw material, scavenged from the debris of battle, the angled steel beams of a Czech Hedgehog tank obstacle, abandoned by the retreating Germans. With his unit's mechanics, he welded a vertical steel bar to the front bumper of their Jeep. At the top, they cut a sharp V-shaped notch. The principle was brutally simple. The bar would catch the wire and force it upwards, away from the occupants' necks and into the notch, which would sever it on impact. They tested it by driving into a taut rope. It snapped cleanly. They had just invented an active defense against an invisible killer. Sergeant Warner had protected his own crew. But one modified Jeep was a single point of light in a vast and growing darkness. How could a life-saving idea, born from scrap metal and ingenuity, spread faster than the threat it was designed to defeat? The answer was simple: it couldn't. The idea spread organically, like a virus of innovation. A reconnaissance trooper from one squadron would see the device on a Jeep from another unit at a crossroads or a refueling point. The logic was immediate and undeniable. He'd return to his own motor pool, find his maintenance sergeant, and describe what he saw. Soon, field workshops across the front were buzzing with unofficial activity. Soldiers became scavengers and engineers, turning the debris of war into life-saving tools. They used whatever they could find: sections of German railroad track, steel beams from bombed-out buildings, even the metal frames of discarded beds. Designs varied wildly. Some were simple vertical posts. Others were T-shaped. Some had hooks designed to grab and hold the wire, while others, like Sergeant Warner's, featured a sharpened notch to sever it. It was a textbook example of battlefield adaptation, a solution that grew from the bottom up, driven not by orders, but by the universal instinct for survival. The effectiveness of these homemade devices was impossible to ignore. Unit commanders, seeing fewer casualties and less damage to their vehicles, quickly moved to formalize the innovation. Instead of relying on individual soldiers to scrounge for parts, they issued orders to their own ordnance maintenance companies, the field-level mechanics and welders responsible for keeping the Army rolling. These workshops began producing the cutters in small, semi-standardized batches for every Jeep, M8 Greyhound, and M20 utility car in their formation. It was during this phase that the device earned one of its most common names, the Coulon cutter. The name honored Corporal Robert Coulon of the 2nd Armored Division, another soldier who, like Warner, had independently developed a similar device. As different units adopted the technology, they often gave it their own local names, but it was the Coulon name, associated with the famous Hell on Wheels division, that stuck. The improvised tool of a few sergeants was now becoming an unofficial but essential piece of Allied equipment. And just as this physical defense was spreading across France, the nature of the threat began to change, not on the ground, but in the minds of the soldiers. By the fall of 1944, Allied armies were closing in on the borders of Germany itself. In Berlin, Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels saw an opportunity. On the radio, in speeches broadcast across the Reich, he began to invoke a new, terrifying myth: the werewolf. He called on every German man, woman, and child to become a phantom warrior, to resist the invaders with sabotage, assassination, and terror. The werewolf, the broadcast declared, will wage a fanatical war from behind the enemy lines. Allied intelligence intercepted these broadcasts. Translations and summaries circulated through command posts. And on the front lines, the GIs, already facing booby traps, mines, and ambushes, now had a name for the unseen enemy who strung wires across the roads. The threat was no longer just a desperate tactic of a retreating army. It was now framed as the opening salvo of a nihilistic, nationwide insurgency. From the German side, the reality was far more mundane. For the battered Wehrmacht, falling back toward the fatherland, stringing a wire across a road was a standard delaying action, a tactic taught in every sapper school. It was cheap, required minimal manpower, and was brutally effective at sowing fear and slowing an advance. It was a military problem, not an ideological crusade. In their reports, German engineers expressed surprise at how quickly the Americans developed and deployed a simple, effective countermeasure. They saw the wire cutters not as a response to a secret terror campaign, but as a clever solution to a conventional battlefield hazard. Meanwhile, the real Werwolf organization was a phantom in its own right. Officially created by a secret order from Heinrich Himmler in late 1944 and placed under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Hans Adolf Preutzmann, it was an organization that existed almost entirely on paper. Preutzmann was given an impossible task: to build a nationwide guerrilla army in a matter of months. With no centralized command structure, no dedicated supply chain, and almost no time for training. More importantly, he had no support from the German people, who were exhausted by years of total war and simply wanted it all to end. The Werwolf was a specter, a propaganda weapon far more potent in Goebbels' broadcasts than it ever was in the forests of Germany. The GIs had a tool to defeat the wire. But in their minds, they were no longer just fighting German soldiers. They were fighting ghosts. And the biggest ghost of them all now had a name. How real was the Werwolf? The answer, pieced together from captured German archives and post-war interrogations, was shocking. The Werwolf was almost entirely a myth. The organization under SS General Preutzmann was a catastrophic failure. It existed on paper, but in reality, it was a collection of disparate, untrained groups, often teenagers and old men, with no weapons, no explosives, and no coherent strategy. Most cells disbanded the moment Allied troops arrived. The few that didn't were quickly rounded up. The Werwolf's one notable success came in March 1945, when a small commando unit assassinated the Allied-appointed mayor of Aachen. But this was an isolated act, not the start of a national resistance. The brutal truth was that the wire traps American soldiers had been encountering since the summer of 1944 had no connection to the Werwolf program. They were a standard, low-tech tactic employed by regular German army engineers during a retreat. The Allies were fighting two different enemies. One was the tangible threat of a steel wire on a dark road set by a disciplined soldier. The other was a phantom, a ghost conjured by propaganda. The wire cutter was a brilliant solution to the first problem, but the fear of the Werwolf, that was a weapon for which there was no steel defense. So if the wire cutters weren't a specific countermeasure to the largely non-existent werewolves, how did the two become so famously linked in history? The answer lies in the creation of a legend. And, like all powerful wartime innovations, the wire cutter soon acquired a legend, a story that needed a hero. According to the popular account, that hero was General George S. Patton. The story paints a vivid picture. Patton, seeing the wire threat to his beloved Third Army, personally sketches a design and orders his ordnance officers to mass produce it. In this telling, the wire cutter is not a product of slow, muddy evolution, but a flash of battlefield genius from a legendary commander. It's a powerful, compelling narrative, and it is almost certainly not true. There is no official order, no memo, no diary entry from Patton or his staff that confirms his direct involvement in the cutter's invention or initial deployment. The historical record points overwhelmingly to men like Sergeant Warner and Corporal Cullen, soldiers who solved a deadly problem with scrap metal and a welding torch, long before the device became widespread. So why did the Patton myth take hold? Because it was simple, heroic, and fit the persona of a commander known for his aggressive, solution-oriented leadership. A single general's brilliant order is a much cleaner narrative than the messy, decentralized reality of hundreds of soldiers innovating across dozens of workshops. The Patton story gave the wire cutter a heroic pedigree, But in doing so, it obscured the device's true, and perhaps more important, origin. And that true origin reveals something fundamental about how the war was actually won. We began with a strange device on the front of a Jeep, and a question: was it a defense against a secret army of Nazi fanatics? The answer is no. The wire cutter was not a top-down response to the phantom Werwolf organization. It was a bottom-up solution to a real but far more conventional threat: a simple steel cable strung across a road by a retreating soldier. It wasn't designed by a famous general in a command tent, but by men like Sergeant Warner in a field workshop.
And it wasn't deployed by a single order, but spread organically, from one soldier to another, through shared experience and sheer necessity. The wire cutter is therefore a powerful symbol, not of the genius of one man, but of the collective, adaptive intelligence of an entire army on the move. The device itself was built to protect a soldier's body from a piece of wire, but its legend was built to protect something far larger: a nation's memory, shielding it from the messy, anonymous, and often improvised reality of how a war is truly fought and won.